Hi, my name's Simon Zadek. I am the co-CEO of a Swiss-based not-for-profit organization called NatureFinance. Our mission is to encourage the alignment of global financial flows with equitable nature-positive outcomes. So basically, what is the connection between nature and climate objectives and the way in which our global financial system works? No, definitely not. Last time I checked, we invented the financial system. It wasn't a sunspot or God or any other third-party process. And what we can invent, we can change. So 10 years ago, there wasn't a central bank or financial regulator on the planet that understood anything about climate beyond, the financial climate or the economic climate. And today, I would say there isn't a significant central bank or financial regulator in the world that is not thinking about where the climate and increasingly the nature agenda fits into their mandate to maintain financial stability or fair markets or inform investors effectively, ensure that companies measure and report on risk as they should be. So that would be a really important signal of change. I think we see climate and nature fitting increasingly into a set of financial instruments and funds, from carbon markets to biodiversity credit markets to the way in which sovereign debt markets, $100 trillion, is beginning to bring nature onto the balance sheet of sovereigns, and so take it into account in its analysis of sovereign risk. And so the logic remains fundamentally the same. One's looking at, what are the risks of investment and the potential returns, but one is considering nature and climate factors increasingly in that. What hasn't changed is the logic of financial markets, to embrace a broader purpose. So I think that, first of all, Herman was broadly right, although it's a high-level generalization. Clearly climate change and nature's destruction kind of demonstrates his point admirably and sadly. I think that financial markets, in terms of their internal logic, can be changed to a degree in the sorts of ways that I've described. A company that is dependent on nature but not factoring in those risks can be forced or will wish to take those risks more into account. But if those risks aren't material, then it won't take it into account on its own and through a traditional business lens. And then policy becomes important, social mobilization and campaigning in the way it affects citizen action, taxpayers' action, savers' action, investors' action. All of those factors make a difference to try and shift the logic of financial markets more towards a purposive outcome than a sort of inclusive but similar logic. I think one needs policies, regulations, and standards to shape markets. There's no such thing as a free market. Markets are created by us, and they have market actors, obviously with their own interests, but there's no market in the world, frankly, even illegal markets that don't operate with some sort of set of rules. And so climate policies, translate into liabilities to investors, or climate policies translate into repricing of assets because they believe that fossil fuel assets are going to be stranded. Same for nature and others. Financial regulators, particularly the regulatory side rather than the monetary policy side, will be concerned about which sort of regulations to impose to ensure that these broader set of systemic risks, not only specific risks, are taken into account, which is why you have the growth of transition plans and scenarios, all the way through to anti-money laundering rules, given that the third largest source of illicit financial flows in the world relates to nature crimes. But anti-money laundering rules today take account of illicit funds flowing into a financial institution through the payment system, but doesn't take account of the effect on nature-related crime of investment behavior. So there are many different policies and standards and regulations and laws that do exist, can be repurposed and strengthened, or could be brought into existence. Think of the whole agenda on rights of nature, which 10 years ago, even those advocating rights of nature, would have considered to be a completely marginal, tokenistic way of thinking about how to develop a legal system. Today, I would say 10, 15 countries have actively embraced a rights of nature regulatory framework for specific aspects of nature, like as it relates to a particular river or a particular ecosystem. And one can well imagine those sorts of innovative legal structures becoming increasingly important in the future. So probably the one that is most hotly contested in the negotiations is so-called DSI, digital sequencing of biogenetics. And the debate is if extracting and then creating synthetic versions of biodiversity brings profit, say, to the biofuels industry or the biopharmaceutical industry, who pays for that original extraction of value, which has then been synthesized and multiplied across a billion pills, say, or vast acreage of biofuels. And the debate going on here is this an IPR issue, intellectual property rights issue, or is this a profit share model that one should construct, which certainly the business community is not keen on, or is there some central fund that one moves money through? So this is soft policy, trying to create the right architecture to balance the interests of businesses that are extracting value from biodiversity and nature stewards, whether they be local communities or indigenous people or sovereigns, who wish to be paid for that. So this is a major debating point here and will be increasingly important as biodiversity becomes an increasingly important part of value creation across many different sectors in the global economy. A second example, less in the negotiations and more in the sort of surrounding circus, if you like, of Cop16, is the debate and practice around biodiversity credit markets, an area I've been involved in very closely as well. Are these going to suffer the same disgrace as voluntary carbon markets have over recent years and not support financing flows to nature stewards to restore and conserve nature, but rather end up as a sort of either dysfunctional or actually worse, an accentuation of the extraction of value from biodiversity and a strengthening of the inequalities associated with unfair remuneration or land dispossession. And so the development of those sorts of markets require market design that in turn requires figuring out the right policy and regulatory architecture so that one can seek to drive public interest markets of like that forward effectively, delivering private gain to the traders that are involved, but ensuring that the public interest side of it is secured. Well, the big debate, of course, the Colombian government, has a broad-based manifesto that is against the financialization of nature for good or bad purposes, but at a principled level, and that tends to lean them and others likewise towards policy, regulatory, and public financing solutions rather than market-based solutions, whereas countries including Colombia, which currently has a sort of market-based regulatory mechanism around biodiversity credits, or other countries like Australia and the UK, India, South Africa, parts of Brazil, all have sort of pay for ecosystem services variants that have market characteristics. And so you have both an ideological view that the financialization of nature drives the logic of capital into the management of biodiversity, which might pragmatically work in certain instances, but structurally is a misunderstanding of what kinds of global economy is needed to interface with our natural environment, which of course we are 100% dependent on. And then whether you call them pragmatists or innovators of a different kind, view market-based solutions as part of the solution set that can, in practical terms, support investment flows into nature restoration and conservation. And so there's an ideological schism there. I think the folks who tend to be antagonistic towards the financialization agenda have history on their side, I would broadly say. Markets have been part of the problem. Are we really saying they could be a significant part of the solution? Fighting fire with fire, if I was to put it in simple terms. And we know that as a global species, we use markets for many of the things we do in society. We're not a set of just formal institutional processes or community networks. We have trading patterns and have had forever and a day. And so ignoring the role of markets and the potential for markets to provide some of the solutions seems also to speak against a sort of a broader historical read across of the way in which humans organize themselves. So it's our largest nature market. It's our $4 trillion soft commodity market. That's sort of the flywheel of the global nature market. It moves food and other land and sea-based products around the world at scale. It drives our global food value chains, as well as obviously non-food products like forestry products. And it feeds what is an $8 trillion part of our global economy, i.e. the food system. So if you think of our global economy as being about $100 trillion, the food part of it, including distribution and supermarkets and production and everything, amounts to about $8 trillion. So it's a chunk of the system, right? And our soft commodity markets are dominated by a very small number of companies largely not publicly listed. Yeah, in fact, there are 6 of them that have a large portion of that $4 trillion. They are very heavily integrated vertically and horizontally. They are opaque, and arguably the regulators of commodity markets are many steps behind even where conservative institutions like central banks and financial regulators have got to in thinking about and acting on climate and nature issues. So by no means the only part of the story, but it's an interesting lightning rod of why is it that our commodity markets look like that and function that way? Why is it that there's so little transparency? Why is it that in the context of the Ukraine war, commodity traders have profited enormously, and yet the only thing we heard about was the increased profits of oil and gas companies, with commodity traders somehow sitting under the public radar? Why is it that they're not pushed to disclose more, to enforce traceability conditions, to unpack aspects of their oligopoly, because they clearly have an oligopoly? And why is it that that isn't on the front page every day? And part of the answer to that are things that one knows about: lobbying, offshore tax havens, political pressure to prevent regulatory strengthening of commodity markets, as well as the fact that these companies effectively move product all over the world. And as we saw during COVID, notwithstanding the many problems that COVID brought, our global food supply chains more or less didn't fall apart. So one can't assume that they are a universal problem, but one's got to unbundle the contributions that they bring to global well-being, if you like, and the problems of those markets and the difficulties of improving them through a public interest lens. Obviously, there are many, many other examples of different markets and how does one improve them, and can one and can't one, and there are variations of the story I've just given. But if we can't change that global flywheel, which is those commodity markets, it's quite hard to imagine how other bits of the nature economy are going to function in a more effective way. Let's take a couple of examples. So if we'd been having this conversation 10 years ago, and I'd said to you, in 10 years, the African continent will be increasingly stuffed full of renewables, modern renewables, although I'm sure you are insightful and forward-looking, you probably would have burst out laughing. And yet, 10 years later, that's what we see, with many warts and spots and gaps and all the usual challenges that remain in place. That didn't involve large-scale, multilateral, international cooperation agreements concerning technology transfer. So that sort of archetypal 20th century social contract view of the world. Instead, what it involved was Germany doing a feed-in tariff that used tens of billions of German tax dollars to ramp up demand for renewables, China taking advantage of that, and going to scale, driving down the cost of kilowatt-hour equivalent of wind and particularly solar, the use of innovative financial instruments like the so-called feed-in tariff, probably the most important financial innovation in the green transition area in the last 10, 15 years. And then an awful lot of activities by private actors, multilateral development banks, and many other players to create projects in practice and get them funded and connected to the grid and overcome incumbent interests on the ground. There was no grand bargain there, and one might argue that means we were in a second best world, and that a grand bargain might have helped. But my guess is there was no grand bargain to be made, and yet in the renewable space, we have in effect driven a massive transfer of technology across the world from 3, 4, 5 countries, coming out of India, coming out of the States, coming out of Europe, and increasingly now coming out of China. Yeah, so that's an interesting use case without any of the ideological trappings of so-called technology transfer agreements. Now let's go to a second example. So what's the equivalent of that in the food system? So today, because we're the good guys, we talk positively about regenerative agriculture, and for good reason. But in a reality that we are facing vis-a-vis the pace of climate change, there are many parts of the world that will have low or no soil nutrition within a decade or more. I mean, we already see desertification in parts of sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, as Jim Skee, the chair of the IPCC, said a few days ago, we're already seeing desertification in southern Europe. And so regenerative agriculture has no place where there's no soil nutrition, or where open weather conditions are so volatile, that you can't run stable crop production processes anymore. So what does one do in that situation? Is it one abandons those territories and countries, large-scale migration? Is it that one's dependent on imports, but how are you paying for that? Is it that one's dependent on humanitarian aid, in which case what are the limits, when that runs into the billions of people? Or is there some equivalent in the food system in terms of capital-intensive technology to what we've seen in the energy system that doesn't depend on soil and doesn't depend on open weather conditions? And of course, we know in theory that that means vertical farming and lab-grown protein of various different kinds. We know that those technologies are really immature. We know that they're very high cost. And we know that that's where the renewable industry was 15 years ago. And so what does that mean? Are we going to follow the same path as we have with renewables? So no overall architecture, technology transfer agreements, if you like, but instead the equivalent of Germany in the food system, ramping up the use of, capex intensive, climate resilient food technologies in their production process. Might be China this time. In fact, probably will be China this time, bringing down the cost of nutrition to a market equivalent to kilowatt hour in the renewable sector, and then beginning to export that technology around the world. Is that the model? Or do we have a more ideological view about the need for grand bargains in the way in which climate resilient food technology is going to be taken up around the world, given the critical importance of food security and the growing impact of climate change? I would bet on the same model as renewables in the food technology system. I know large-scale multilateral agreements, but much more individual countries deciding this is a competitive advantage as well as a food security opportunity, like China, investing heavily in R&D, getting the economies of scale and learning, driving down the cost of that technology, and then bringing that technology as part of their competitiveness position and geopolitical positioning into the global economy, in particular to low and middle income countries in the tropics, where the greatest loss of soil is going to be. Those seem to be the right conversations to have now. So rather than having these broad, frankly rather abstract conversations about technology transfer, we've got to focus on particular sectors, particular classes of technology, and try and understand what the dynamics are to get them into place at the right price. So back to the example first. What I described was a bunch of governments evolving the food system, not a bunch of companies. And the fact that in the renewable space, Siemens or GE or Vestas out of Denmark or whoever it is out of India or China, as private companies have been involved, those markets were created by governments. Let's not mess around here. But let's kind of come back. So that's just to get the record clear. That this idea that there's a sort of crazed market. There are enough problems already without caricaturing the problem. So let's focus on the problems.
Okay, sorry. And
But let me just come back to your point. I just want to try and downplay the ideological issues and upplay kind of what's really going on. I think the challenge in the food sector, which is a different order to problems in the energy sector in terms of solution sets and in terms of vulnerability. Remember, it isn't just feeding 8 billion people. There are 3.4 billion people dependent on food production for their livelihoods. Before you get to biodiversity, frankly, what are they going to be doing in 10 years' time? Particularly, smallholders at scale across major parts of the global south. I'm less worried about large-scale agribusinesses sitting in the US or, frankly, even in Brazil. And so the dilemma one has is the regenerative agriculture movement, that I am completely supportive of, has to stress test their position against a 2 to 3 degree climate change. And when you do that, you go, it's not going to work in Ghana, and it is going to work in Norway. And that isn't a global north, global south split. It's different temperature changes. And so where it can work and where we can make it work through investment, I'm totally up for that. But there are going to be large tracts of the world where that's just not going to work. And we need the sustainable food community to get their heads around that, rather than continuing to insist that the solution is regenerative agriculture everywhere. Because it just isn't if you've got, in northern Kenya, a desert. And then one asks the question, so if that's true in some parts of the world, how do we as a progressive community own that transition? What kinds of technologies? Is it going to lead to a reconcentration of power in the food system, just with a different set of technologies? So it's from Cargill to whoever dominates that technology? Or are there different ownership models? Can it produce a diversity of foodstuffs? Can it reduce food waste to almost zero? Can it function with only embodied water use within the product, where in vertical farming already it's only embodied use in the best technologies? So these are nature related, but not by being nature integrative, but by unlocking from nature. And it will come as no surprise to you or me that the nature community or the ecological community, understandably in a way, is more interested in an integrative approach. How do we make the global economy integrative to the way in which biodiversity works? But I think we need to have a double approach where part of it is that, and part of it is how do we deliver critical services to people that is absent of nature solutions in parts of the world where those nature solutions are not possible. And food and water are the two single most important areas to focus on. So it's not either or, it's both in different contexts. But for that, we need to jettison a sort of everything is ecological and embrace, frankly, a higher level of complexity and urgency. Best case is that my daughter survives. And that's the same with everybody. And so there's part of us that think about large systems, and there's part of us that thinks about small systems. Ourselves, our immediate family, our community, our tribe, our religion, our country. Why do I say that? It's because in the main, we solve to small system problems as a species, not large system problems. And yet, part of our strength is that we're increasingly conscious of large system problems. And so, part of the question becomes, do we have large system solutions because we have large system consciousness, or do we have to understand that humans in the main approach solution pathways through small system solutions? Yeah. And small doesn't mean irrelevant, but help one understand pathways. Yeah, because it's very easy to conceptualize a large system solution that bears no relationship to change pathways. And most change pathways function through small system solution architectures, which then may or may not be scalable. Yeah, so that's, I think, kind of one way of thinking about it. You know, so I do think about my daughter, and I wonder what her life would be if she lived in northern Kenya, and the fact that in reality I'd rather she lives in Switzerland. Yeah, and everybody will be thinking about safety where they can in those terms, number one. Number two, I think there is an inclination towards the discarding of pessimism that is actually truth-telling. So let me give an example. It is exceedingly likely that there will be 1 billion or more permanent refugees on the move without any prospect of a passport from a Westphalian state ever again. So today there are about 130 million. They're sitting in camps, they're sitting in countries, some of them can work, some of them can't work. They're trying to get citizenship, they're trying to get the right to work, and we're treating it as a small-scale system problem, actually, even though it's lots of people already. But if one accepts that, say, within 15, 20 years, the likelihood is very high that there will be 1 billion or more, then you know that the approach that you're taking to solve the problem today is not scalable to address that larger problem. One needs a completely different way of thinking about how to deal with the world with more than 1 billion people permanently on the move. Is that a different kind of citizenship? A different set of rights? Remember, at the end of the 18th century, nobody could conceive of the idea of a trade union. Yeah, just was the idea that workers would organize was like insane. You know, we were just in the process of ditching slavery, for God's sake. Yeah. Today, we can't conceive of a nation of refugees spread across 180 countries. But why not? Yeah, so stepwise innovation is required in every area, as well as small system pathways to actually get there. Yeah, we know that. I'm not saying anything weird, I'm just saying it in my particular way. Who's preventing that? So traditionally we go, you know, it's Exxon, or it's Cargill, or it's some mean-spirited government, and all of that is true and more, but actually the refugee industry, so the good guys, are part of the problem as well. The regenerative food community, the good guys, are part of the problem as well. Yeah, and so actually we have a double-barreled problem to resolve if we want quantum innovation, which is we've got to get the incumbents that are really problematic out of the way, but also we have to persuade those that have historically solved problems at a different order level to step back and see that their approaches are no longer appropriate. Yeah. Do I think that's possible? Absolutely. You know, humans have so many lousy characteristics, they're hard to list. But in certain types of crises, behave at scale in the most extraordinary ways. We can do that. Unfortunately, it's often in times of war. Yeah. Great financial crisis, we turned everything upside down. COVID, to some degree, we turned everything upside down. We used Finland's idea of a universal income that everybody had said was a really lousy idea at the scale of $15 trillion, which we spent out in 36 months. You know, we're able to do incredible things in the right kind of crisis. And clearly, the climate and nature crisis today are the wrong kind of crises. That it's not precipitating those phase shift steps, it's leaving those options, which don't have to be invented. There's an amazing bank of ways of thinking, but it's leaving them as unreasonable, impractical, impossible, inconceivable, inappropriate. Yeah. And so what does it take to create the right narrative that establishes a crisis that allows some of those phase shift ways of working to become obviously the thing to do? And I feel we're closer and closer to that moment. More than 30 seconds. You'll know the adage, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Right? I sometimes think it's more interesting to think of the road to heaven is paved with bad intentions. Yeah, that maybe some of the outcomes that we're looking for will happen for all the wrong reasons. And that's going to be an interesting way in which to make change. We're always, as a progressive community, looking to educate and inspire and catalyze and act for the right reasons in the right way. Actually, it very rarely works in that way in practice. Usually, it's a strange assortment of evil and awful and wonderful and coincidental and random reasons that leads things to actually happen in extraordinary ways. So, come back to food for a second. What's going to unlock, at one level, the hegemony of a small number of global commodity traders and agribusinesses that dominate our ultra-processed food export industry will be climate change, will be nature destruction, and will be a collapsing belief in global food supply chains as a source of food security. And that belief has dominated our world for the past half a century at least. So take an example. China has 85% of Brazil's soya and beef output, buys it, but also has a 20-year strategy for food self-sufficiency. Food self-sufficiency, 1.33 billion people. Yeah, now, let's put aside for a second how they do that. Yeah, it comes a bit back to these technology questions and so on and so forth. And let's just assume that it's China, so they're probably going to do it. Yeah, and that has extraordinary implications for where they've been originating food up until now. Yeah, which may release land and disrupt agribusinesses and collapse monopolies and oligopolies and allow for rewilding or open the opportunity of local production systems for all the wrong reasons. Yeah, because China decides that they don't trust anybody anymore. Not because everybody saw the light and planted berries and turned the soil. Yeah, and so obviously it's a vulgar example, that caricatures the point. But I think that one should look for not always the right reason and wave, because those tend to be very small waves that one thinks one is creating, but instead look for waves that are happening anyway and go, how do I surf that wave and shape a set of outcomes that could actually lead to some progressive results? I'm a firm believer that certainly in my world and my activity, if I've made a difference, it's not because I've created waves. It's because I've waited for waves, and when spotted them, I've surfed them in the right way. Yeah, and I think the food, China, regen ag, ultra-processed food narrative, which could be a good story, is a really fine example of that. So let me focus on the finance side just for a second, although I'll talk more generally. So conservation finance, has a half-century history, and I'm sure someone with more knowledge of me tell me it has a multi-century history, and has been completely irrelevant, basically, until 2018-19. And then out of the box, suddenly NatureFinance became a thing. And in the space of 96 months, you can work out the number of weekends that involved or the number of seconds or minutes, you had this explosion of activity about how one finances nature, where nature fits into global financial systems, and what the policy and regulatory and financial and market innovation dynamics might be around that. And so one sits there and one goes, why the hell? There's nothing new in terms of what we've always known one needs to address. But suddenly you have this extraordinary shift in the innovation curve. And today we're sitting here with every street corner having a conference about biodiversity credits, and just kind of a wild moment of innovation. And CBD is both a cause of that and a beneficiary of that. But they're neither one or the other alone. I don't think the CBD process has created that outcome, but I think the GBF is supporting that wave. We can debate why the wave is there and whether it's real and how long and so on and so forth. So we're surfing that wave, and CBD is part of that wave. And we need to understand that waves crash, and the innovation drive that at the moment looks hugely ambitious, in many parts will level out, as people meet incumbent interest problems and other dilemmas that it can't get through. So innovation itself will not drive us towards scale success, but we've been through 4 years, really 2018-19 to today, of the most extraordinary innovation in a topic now called NatureFinance. It was called conservation finance, that nobody could have imagined was actually going to happen. So then the question is, how does one get beyond the noise and the sort of innovation on every street corner problem and pick out the things that one thinks are not just winners, but are winners that can scale, and then steward those winners in a way that they're not dumbed down through inertia and incumbent interests as they begin to actually hit the buffers of different actors' interests within the system. So that's where we are now. In my first sort of panel session keynote here at CBD, my opening comments were, we're at the end of the beginning when one's looking at nature finance, where we've had this amazing explosion, and now we've got to get serious in thinking, where are the winning bits, what's the noise we've got to ignore, who are the players that were fun but need to go home, and how do we avoid, during the scaling process, it all getting dumbed down. I think that's where we are now. CBD has a role to play in that, but probably the role has less to do with what happens in the negotiating rooms in terms of the text that is agreed, but does have a lot to do with governments in the way in which they drive forward policy and regulation, because the market will not drive change alone in the same way that policies and regulations won't drive outcomes alone.
Simon, thanks so much for talking with me. Do you have any other words you'd like to share?
It's exhausting. It's exhausting, it's fun, and it's serious, all in equal measure. Thank you.